I'm Saul Yurick. You probably remember me from my earlier testimony back in November when Fred Chaffin testified. I was checking the notes. I believe you also had our patient Sharon Jefferson testifying in here. And I really appreciate you calling me back. If you would please pay some close attention, perhaps now would be a good chance to focus on what's up here and take some notes. That would be a good way to handle the next 20 minutes of my presentation. I appreciate your attention and your time. I have noticed since cyclamine got put into the public eye, there's been major sways in public opinion based on what I read in the New York Times. And I hope with my testimony here today, I can help clarify some confusion, make some explanations about what's being misrepresented in the media, what I believe to have been misrepresented a bit in the testimony, and answer any questions you might have about the drug. So thank you for having me. I think it's a great decision. Of course you know that the deadline is coming for you to vote. I don't envy your position. I'm not here to make a recommendation about what you should do with cyclamine. It is in your hands. I am just here to straighten out any misconceptions. The first misconception, the one that actually makes my logical brain get a little emotional, is that cyclamine is not the happy drug. The happy drug, I saw this expression in a New York Times article, people referring to cyclamine as a happy drug. That's a tale. That's a falsehood. And I think that in order to get that point across, I'll have to show you how cyclamine really works. But happiness is an exaggeration. It's an oversimplification. The best word that we can come up with for how happiness or how cyclamine affects human behavior is the word contentment. Cyclamine does cause contentment. I think we're happy with that word. And here's how we know this. We tested it for years and years and years. Cyclamine has a chance to come to market at this point, having had FDA approval, depending on what you decide with it. It's not something that we developed yesterday. We've been testing it for years on all sorts of lab animals, most particularly for mice. I told you last time about how we even came to want to create cyclamine for the lab conditions, the lab mouse conditions in our lab. Whatever happens with cyclamine, we've solved that problem. And I'm very happy to say that our lab conditions, our lab animals are up 40%, where they would have been too agitated to live in those conditions without cyclamine. So we feel successful. I've got no other stake in cyclamine beyond what we've already developed. I'm very satisfied with our use for cyclamine. And then of course, we've been testing the human trials for more than 10 years. That's a lot of human hours of cyclamine. 10 years times the hundreds and hundreds of patients that have taken cyclamine is a lot of research. So here's why happiness is the happy drug is a bad name for cyclamine. This is the normal emotional life of a human. This could be a day. We have swings, lows, highs. We spend a great deal of our time right around this contentment line, neither feeling great nor feeling glum. This could be a week in the emotional life of a human. This could be the average of a year in the emotional life of a human. We fluctuate. And that's the normal condition that Mother Nature gave us. What cyclamine does is it doesn't create anything more above contentment in the happiness vein. It simply cuts off anything below the line where we call contentment. This area here where we're feeling neither high highs or low lows. As you can see, the spikes of happiness are no greater. They're not amplified. They don't last any longer. There's still fluctuation in that area. We've just removed the sadness, everything below the line. How it works? Well, cyclamine uses the body's natural tools. It stimulates the brain to create more of what the brain already creates. Here's a drawing of a microscopic look at the synapses between nerve endings in the brain. There are many signals that go across the synapses in the brain. The synapses, of course, are where the nerve endings come together and send a signal down and down and down and down the line. There are many signals that go across the nerve endings, and the emotional signals are sent through the T cell receptors. Now, in any relatively healthy human brain, there are T cells floating around all the time. The brain creates these at a small rate all the time, just regularly sends them out. And what the T cells do is when there is one that comes near a nerve ending, a synapse, a receptor, an empty receptor, the T cell gets sort of sucked right in. It's really amazing to watch under the microscope. It gets sucked right in. And when the T cell receptors are blocked at a particular nerve ending, it actually blocks the lower emotional points from passing through those nerve endings. It stops the sadness, essentially. So we discovered, we had a hypothesis 20 years ago. If there were more T cells in the blood, would all of the T cell receptors become blocked, and would that sense of sadness, discomfort, anger, those negative emotions, would they all stop? So what if we could stimulate the brain to create more of these T cells? And that's what cycamine does. Cycamine creates a flood of T cells in the brain. It stimulates the brain to dump T cells right into the blood. Now, the life of a T cell is only about a half a day, about 12 hours. The brain, as I said, is pumping out a slow, steady supply of these all the time without cycamine. And if it was doing that, they would just accumulate and accumulate and accumulate until we were already flooded with T cells. But that doesn't happen because the T cells die off after about 12 hours, which actually is pretty wonderful, because that means that when cycamine is introduced to the body and the brain creates a flood of T cells, we know that that dose of cycamine is only going to last about 12 hours. That it's only going to last as long as the T cells survive, and then they die off and get reabsorbed into the blood. So the length of time of a dose is about a half a day, 12 hours. And the other thing that we learned was that there's no chance of an overdose of cycamine. We experimented with different amounts, first on the mice, of course, and the appropriate dose for our lab mice is 0.2 milligrams. That will stimulate the brain enough to create the flood that we're looking for. 0.4, twice as much, doesn't have twice the effect because all the T cell receptors are already filled. If you give mice a megadose, 10 milligrams of cycamine, over 1,000 times, 100 times the appropriate dose, it has no more effect than the appropriate dose. And so when we extrapolate this to humans, and we begin the human trials, we saw that the appropriate dose for humans is 5 milligrams. If one took a whole bottle, 90 pills, 95 milligram pills all at once, it would have the same effect as taking just one. You have your T cell receptors full or you do not. And that's what cycamine does. Any extra T cells that are in the body, once the receptors are full, they just float around and they're just reabsorbed into the body. Another thing we looked at, as any good researcher looks for, is the combinatory effects. What happens when cycamine is introduced to the body and the body has other non-natural elements in it, other medications, other substances? Combinatory effects is the scientific term. Something you might hear it as drug interactions. And the wonderful thing about cycamine is that chemically it only works its magic in the brain for about 5 minutes. The dose does not last very long. It just stimulates the brain enough to create the T cells, and then the T cells are what make the emotional life stabilized. So the chemical reaction of the cycamine pill doesn't react with anything that we started with. Important medications for keeping people alive, cholesterol medications, diabetic medications, heart medications, antidepressant medications. And there's no chemical reaction between cycamine and these drugs. Ethically, we didn't try street drugs and the chemicals involved with them in our experiments, but we had humans who did that on their own and self-reported, cocaine users, heroin users, marijuana users. And so we were able to observe through close scientific observation and self-reporting of the individual's feelings that while the effects of some psychotic drugs seem a little different when on psychomine, it's not from the chemical interaction, it's from the emotional interaction. I'll get into that in just a minute. So chemically, we don't have an interaction with other drugs. Chemically, we don't develop a dependence on psychomine. Because it's the body's own tools, because it's something the body does anyway, there's no chance of getting chemically addicted to psychomine. Addiction is a funny word, and I believe that science still relies on the term of addiction as being something that the body becomes chemically dependent upon. Although psychiatric research shows that there are different kinds of addiction. You may have heard of video game addiction or sex addiction or addiction to behaviors. These are more habit forms than the clinical terms of addiction that I'm using, but it should be noted that an over-reliance on anything can create a dependence, psychomine included. In our human trials, we had many different types of doses given to different types of people. And the people that were on a steady supply of psychomine all the time, 2 pills a day for many days, we found that when we tried to take them off of psychomine after a period, if they'd been on psychomine for a period of 6 months or more, it's a long time to not have that lower complement of emotions, those sadness, those difficult, angry emotions. After 6, 7, 8 months without them because of psychomine, when the psychomine was removed, there was an adjustment period. It's not the same as a withdrawal from some of these drugs that you might have heard about. It's not the same as when alcoholics don't have their alcohol, when heroin addicts don't have their opioid, but there was a bit of a discomfort, an uncomfortable period lasting about a week. We grow up regulating our emotions on our own, the full complement of emotions. If we don't have the full complement of emotions for a long enough period of time, when we get them back, it's a little bit of a harsh reality, but we remember, and it doesn't take long to feel normal, quote unquote, normal again. So this word addiction is technically true and a little bit misleading at the same time. So again, here's psychomine. We've just removed the lower part of the emotional fluctuations. You still have fluctuations. You still go from contentment to happiness, and you might be in between, and you might have ups and downs along that spectrum. It's just that your downs won't be so depressant. And because of this, because of these fluctuations, I've also seen it written in the New York Times that some people call it the happy drug, other people call it the zombie drug. That psychomine turns one into a zombie because it removes the emotion. If it removed the emotion, we would all be flatlined the whole day on psychomine. We would all be in the state of just contentment all the time. But clearly that's not what's happening. We still have the high highs and the in-betweens on the happiness scale. So I think that's a really strong misnomer to call it the zombie drug. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear to you. Of course, you know the deadline is coming to vote. You have, well, I've heard that you had 3 choices. I actually am thinking that maybe you have 4 choices. I'll get into that 4th one in a minute. The other piece that I wanted to address was Thompson Fennell's testimony. Right now, I thought it would be important for you to know that psychomine is a very inexpensive drug to manufacture. We're only manufacturing it for the trials. We're only manufacturing on a scale of 100,000 doses at a time. And it only costs us 2 to 3 cents a dose. That's a very, very low amount of money to invest. Since it lasts about 12 hours, to be on psychomine all the time for the test humans in our trials was 5 cents a day. For our lab to create a drug for our human trials to be on psychomine 24 hours. 5 cents a day. It's not an expensive drug. And so when you think about Thompson Fennell's plan, he's offered my lab $10 million for the exclusive patent to the drug. We'll be able to continue using it on the mice as we developed it for. I'm happy for Yale University to receive this grant and reinvest it into more scientific research and tools. So we'll accept that $10 million and hand cyclamine over to Thompson Fennell should you approve it to make it legalized. Costs us 5 cents a day. Probably with economies of scale, if he's going to try to make this available nationally, he could probably create it for a lot less money. He hasn't disclosed what he plans on charging for it, but there's a large profit margin clearly in the pipeline. Just wanted you to consider that when you consider his testimony, which seems to emphasize the benefits of cyclamine, perhaps only emphasize the benefits of cyclamine. So as I said, I think you've been given 3 choices, but you might have 4. You could ban cyclamine and not make it available to anybody. You could decide that cyclamine is too dangerous for the world and keep it out of the hands of everybody. And I wouldn't think that that's a bad choice. I've got my cautious optimism for how it might be helpful, and I've got a little bit of a warning bell for how it might be harmful. You could make it a prescription drug, allowing doctors to hold the keys to open the cyclamine door. You could make it over the counter, such as aspirin, Tylenol, these drugs that have been around a long time that are found to be very low risk in the body. But the 4th choice, if you consider how we handle some recreational drugs like alcohol, alcohol is a drug, like any of these other prescription drugs that we're talking about. You don't need a prescription for alcohol, and it's not banned. We tried that in the 20s. It didn't work. But the good senators at the time thought, well, it's not, the risk is there with alcohol, so we're going to try to keep it out of the hands of minors. So you could make this over the counter, but with an age limit. One has to show ID, and you could decide what that age limit is. Is that going to be 16 years old or 18 years old, 21 years old, 45 years old, which seems a little bit random. So you do have now 4 choices. I do want to talk just a little bit about motivation itself. There are those who say that cyclamine takes away all of our motivation. That's not a fair statement, but there is a lessening of certain kinds of motivation for those who are on cyclamine that we have observed. In life, there are 2 kinds of motivating factors that drive us. There's positive motivation and there's negative motivation. The desire to be great, the desire to be rewarded, the desire to be adored, all positive motivation. Those on cyclamine, since that motivation lives in the upper echelon of the emotional scale, it's very positive emotion. The positive motivation is not affected by those on cyclamine. There are high-achieving people who continue to be high-achieving people when on cyclamine. But about half of our motivation comes from negative motivation as well. And negative motivation is what drives us to not get in trouble, to not be bad, perhaps to not fumble the ball again. And there are people driven by both of these things. And there are people side by side in life, on sports teams, in companies, in marriages, who are driven by positive motivation while their person beside them is driven by negative motivation for the same goal. It's hard to know exactly what drives us. But those who are driven by negative motivations seem to be affected by cyclamine. That without those negative feelings pushing us to be better, we're feeling content, we're not feeling the negative feelings. There is a lapse in motivation in some people on cyclamine, and it's about half of the motivation we experience in our lives. It's about half from positive and half from negative that we all have. So there is, I can say, safely say, a drop in motivation. It varies a little bit from person to person. It varies a lot in how dangerous that drop in motivation is to an individual's life. There are people whose lack of motivation to change the world keep them from being obsessive compulsive and actually make them a little bit calmer, easier to be around, have more friends, have a better life. But there are also people whose drive from negative motivation can cause them harm. Discontent with their job sometimes turns to contentment with one's job, but sometimes it turns to a contentment with one's life without a job, with that crappy car, with that leak in the roof. And it can keep people from reacting in ways that they might otherwise react if they were not on psychomine. Was that a question down front?
Yeah. So 50% of the people act on positive and 50% act on negative.
It's more like in any one person, half of your motivation comes from positive motivation and half comes from negative motivation.
So if I take psychomine, I have half the chance of being like affected negatively.
That's right. So what?
So if the negative makes people feel lack of motivation, and if you hand that out to, let's just say, everyone in the world, half of the people will have a lack of motivation.
It's more like all of the people will have a lack of motivation that that normally would have motivated them from negative causes, but they'll also still have some good motivation from the positive causes. So a student might, who is motivated to study hard and work hard because that student wants to be on the honor roll, that's positive motivation. That student would probably not be affected in those choices. Whereas a student beside him perhaps might be driven to get good grades so that they did not receive a beating at home. That's a negative motivation. That's an avoidance of a bad thing as opposed to the acquisition of a good thing. And that student might be affected and be fine and content with the C's and D's and F's that they were given and not work harder. But that same student also has other motivating factors in their life or other parts of their lives that would also be, that come from a positive motivation as well. So there's a mix in all of us. It's hard to identify. It would take a good psychiatrist to identify how you may be affected before you take psychomine. Otherwise, you would just have to take it and see how your life shook out. But we saw a few, not many, and it depended on the age group. It depended on socioeconomic status and education, but we saw some people's lives get a lot worse who were on psychomine all the time. But we saw many, many people, and I would say more people than that, their lives get a lot better. Interestingly, retirees, older people who had gone through the hard parts of life, they'd acquired a job, they'd raised a family, they've now paid off their home, they've now retired, they don't have to grind the gears of work every day, but maybe they've got some health issues bothering them. Psychomine seemed to help this population intensely because their lives were not overly dependent on them producing something, on them moving, getting up every day and going to work, relying on the support, their families relying on their support. So their qualities of life were more about, my hip is very sore today. I don't want to walk across the street to get to the market. It takes me too long to walk across the street. I'm afraid it's dangerous. Their lives improved in that area for psychomine because they were now motivated to go to the store. They were okay. They were more satisfied with their life. The hip didn't bother them quite as much. The fear of taking longer than they wanted to cross the road was not inhibiting to them. So their qualities of lives improved. Many, many retired people. Younger people in their mid-20s and 30s who are in a more stressful time in life, who are hanging on by a little bit more of a shoestring. They're not established. They don't have a nest egg. They don't have savings and retirement plans. They're early in their careers. They might not be well established with good reputations at their companies. They might be nearer the chopping block, lower on the totem pole. They have more to lose. if they were to lose a little bit of motivation. And anybody whose life that we saw get a little worse tended to be of this demographic. People in their early to mid 20s to early 30s, or even older if they were kind of hanging on, if they were of lower economic status and living more hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck. They have a lot less room for loss in their motivation. So of course your 4 choices, here they are again, consider them well. I'm not invested in any of these choices, as I said. I'm not here to make a recommendation. I'm just here to give you the information and hopefully to answer any other questions you have. This is my entire presentation, gentlemen. If you have other questions, I'm happy to respond to them. And I will consult my notes to make sure that there's nothing that I'm forgetting. All right, I do have one point that I did not make earlier in my presentation, which is that we did see a decrease. And I'd like to say this in terms of Fred, Mr. Officer Chaffin seems a little down on cyclamine. It's true that teenagers make poor choices from time to time. He spends a lot of his time seeing those teenagers who have made poor choices. And cyclamine, might take away some of our motivation from negative aspects to avoid consequences. So his population, his perspective, his look at teenagers might be a little bit skewed. We actually found that the statistics on small crimes of the people who we studied closely taking cyclamine decreased. That generally what motivates somebody to do a crime, to shoplift, to steal, is a discontentment with one's life. And being a little bit more content while on cyclamine actually decreased some of these behaviors. So it was a largely a positive asset to society overall. Now, it didn't reduce all criminal behavior, but it reduced some, I would say up to 25%, which is a cultural positive for cyclamine that I think you should consider as you consider Mr. Chaffin's condemning of the positivity of the drug.
How did you test that?
Well, it was mostly through self-reporting. We have scientific testing. We have, of course, the biological testing, making sure that everybody's physically healthy. But we have an extensive team of psychiatrist interviews to go along with our human trials. Human trials are interesting. They're really quasi-scientific, where we have to create narratives through background histories. You have to have people answer questions over periods of time on differing doses of cyclamine, on cyclamine, off cyclamine, on cyclamine for 5 or 6 months. And the trends when they were receiving placebo versus the trends when they were receiving the actual drug. And we could correlate that against many other human trials so that we could see the patterns.
How did you know the reports were trustworthy?
Some of them were police reports. Some of them were arrest records. But you're right. You have to question. You have to wonder how accurate the self-reporting is. And you have to correlate it against many, many, many people. So we've had hundreds of thousands of, well, not hundreds of thousands, we've had thousands of people in the human trials. So any one anomaly, untruth is going to be balanced out across that number of people. You have a good scientific mind. Yes, Senator in the back.
How many of which were minors if you're going to get older?
How many of which were minors?
How many of us tests were minors if any of them were?
We tested on minors. We set a bar on how young we thought that we should do the human trials, where the ethics started and stopped. And we did not test on anybody younger than 10. That's where we decided that the emotional development needs to fully complete at least to that point. So we did test on what I would consider adolescents, and a good 15% of our trials were on adolescents. And we actually saw a decrease in antisocial behavior. We saw overall increases in performance in school and decreases in arrests, as I said, and criminal behavior in adolescence. But we were very cautious, and it might interest you to know that we didn't want to go any younger than 10 because we don't want to mess too much with Mother Nature. We're given this emotional life to deal with, and if you've been around 2 and 3-year-olds and seen a tantrum, it's an inability to regulate those negative emotions that cause a tantrum. And over time, children learn that. They learn to regulate that. And we wanted to make sure that we weren't offering an escape from the feeling itself so that the child could never learn to regulate that. If we put 2-year-olds on cyclamine for months or years, they might return to a set of emotions that they've never felt before, and it could be problematic. It could be shocking. And so we set our lowest bar at 10, and we tested nobody younger than 10. Also, pregnant women, when many of our human trials, we didn't want to interfere with their lives. Once they became pregnant, we observed the fetal tissue, and we stopped administering cyclamine to the mothers the moment that the blood-brain barrier in the developing fetus started to form, to generate its own T cells. Once it started to generate its own and absorb and start to develop its own emotional life, we stopped the mother from receiving cyclamine because, as you know, mother and fetus share all nutrients and are effectively one body for many, many months. So after the first trimester, no developing children received it. Good questions. Are there any others before I make my next appointment? Okay, well, thank you for your time, senators. I don't envy the decision you have to make. I know that a lot of you feel a little bit on the hot seat in your districts in terms of your constituents not being sure that they agree with your opinion. So I think that probably in your letter to them, it would be great if you cited the evidence that you brought in, showed them your involvement in this discourse, showed them how much you do know. You certainly know more than they do if they've only been reading what's been published in the media. And so show them how informed you are, and they'll trust you. And I'm sure that they'll trust you to make the best decision, as I do. Okay, thank you.